morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining me from. My name is Hanna. I am the chairman and CEO of the International Institute for Software Testing, and I'm pleased to spend the next hour with you, sharing with you my experience and my ideas about exploratory testing. This webinar is hosted by the International Institute for Software Testing, which is the leader in education-based certifications in software testing. Let's get started. In order to decide how to do exploratory testing, as you probably all know, exploratory testing has been around for a long time. The first time we started to hear about it was back in roughly 1996, 1997. And I do not want to mention names here, or that is James Bach or Cam Kane or whoever, because I don't want to get into some political fight of who gets the credit for exploratory testing. But different people have different opinion about how to do exploratory testing. And that's why I always say the way you do exploratory testing always depend on your goal that you're trying to achieve in testing. That's why I'd like you to take a minute or two to think about what are you trying to achieve exactly when you do testing. Go ahead, share with me, if you will, on the questions tab, what you think you would like to achieve when you do testing. Then I will give you my ideas as well. Please go ahead. I'll give you a couple of minutes. Okay, good enough. We don't have a lot of time today, so I'm going to share with you what people have shared here on my screen. Very quick here. Some people say to find issues caused by unusual customer workflow. I want to verify that the acceptance criteria has been met. For the card, I'm assuming you mean for the user story. I have to find undocumented features, and that's a very interesting one. And not too many people think that way. I have to find the corner case issues before a user does. A corner case. I've never seen this term before, Steve. I'm assuming what? Negative cases, unusual cases, abnormal situations. Not sure exactly, but find issue outside the happy path. Okay. I want to try to break the software by testing in unusual way. Of course, I'm receiving much more now. Find the bugs while product is still under development and to help improve the design of the product features. Help to improve the design of the product feature. Bill, thank you so much. That's new to me as well. Not new, but not too many people also think that way. Steve again says unusual or abnormal outside the documented workflow. I think Steve is explaining to us what he meant by corner cases. Yasha says to include in team before development to eliminate requirement bugs. Okay, fine. I'm going to stop here and share with you this. Typically, yes, most people will say, I want to make sure that the software works as expected. Some people says, I want to make sure that the software meets the requirements, and the little bit more negative people will say, find as many problems as possible or find as many bugs as possible. Now, there are a few other things that I don't hear too often from people. Like this, for example, I want to make sure nothing else has been broken, and that's kind of more towards regression testing. I have not seen any one of the feedback I received mention that. How about helping developers write better code? Have you ever thought of that? How could a tester possibly help developers write a better code? I think many people will find that's impossible, right? Because who are we as testers to tell developers how to write a better code? Well, in fact, when you attend the full course of this subject, you will learn my techniques and the methods to help developers do write better code. Because when you do your job in a certain way, using the scenario-based approach that I will be able to touch on it today, and sharing those scenarios back with the developers, then developers can see the gap between what you are going to be testing and and the code they wrote, and they go back and fix their code accordingly. Now, this is as brief as I can explain it, but that's my simple process to allow or to help testers to go back and be able to help developers to write better code. You can either, I don't know if you've ever thought of this one, that as a software tester, you could possibly easily help those who write requirements or who write user stories, like product owners, to write even better requirements or user stories. Again, for many people, for many testers, this seems to be impossible, but it is very possible, again, with the methodology that I teach normally in my full class. I'm not going to be able to explain the full methodology here, but I will touch on it slightly. When you get a requirement or a user story and you start writing or asking questions about that requirement or the user story, and of course you start writing your scenarios after that, as we're going to see in a little bit, then you share back those questions and those scenarios back with the person who wrote the requirement and the developers, of course. Then over time, requirement analysts, requirement engineers, product owners will certainly see the gap between their requirement, the way they wrote it, or their user story, the way they wrote it, and the scenarios and the questions you're asking. So I found this to be over time to help those who write requirements to do a much better job. Not sure if any one of you have thought about this either. I know you know about negative testing very well. And actually, one of the feedback I received from some of you mentioned that. But remember, in positive testing, we're trying to focus on very much the first two here, the first two bullets. We're trying to make sure the system does what it's supposed to do the way it is supposed to do it. But in doing that, we completely forget that we also want to make sure that the system does not do anything that it is not supposed to do. So I call those the shall not do situations. And again, I've covered this in much more details in the full course. May not be able to touch on it much more here. All right. Now, the most important thing in testing, as you can imagine, is to try to minimize the risk that a user will take by using the software. That means that we will have some level of bugs in the software, but the way you do this is to analyze your test cases, you analyze your scenarios to make sure that you test all those ones that represent high risk to the user. So we will be releasing software that has certain level of problems, but as long as we are minimizing the level of risk. And I'm sure you know what that means. That's why we have to use a risk-based approach. Again, in the scenario-based process that I will discuss here today, we do risk-based testing on the scenarios themselves. Last night, I had to go through my presentation and remove some of the slides because I initially had 35 slides, and I realized that I would not be able to finish 35 slides in 1 hour. So I removed one slide or two slides that have to do with doing risk-based testing. But basically, it is about how to take scenarios, set some priorities based on the impact of failure, the probability of failure, and the frequency of the scenario happening, and you do some analysis to pick up the highest risk scenarios to test first. Now, aside from all that, not sure exactly how many of you have thought about defect prevention. Remember, testing is all about finding defects. It's all about defect detection. Now, I always like to teach testers how to become true defect preventer people, because defect prevention is the most effective way to produce high quality software. Briefly, when you find defects, and write your bug report, send it back to your developers. Developers will fix the problem. They send you back the fix. Then you have to retest again, and perhaps while developers are trying to fix a problem, they might actually break the software in other places too. Then you may actually be able to find some of those or may not, and so on. The cycle continues, finding defects, fixing defects, introducing more defects, possibly find those defects that were introduced or not, then go through regression testing. You may find those newly introduced defects or not, and the bottom line is my experience suggests that when we put out the software, it will have many unknown defects. Why? Because those defects were introduced during the fixing of problems. Now, that's why I focus so much on defect prevention. The scenario-based approach, which I will touch on it here, does this exactly. It helps you find problems in the requirements and in the user story and in the code early enough before we even integrate the code or put it through the version control system or anything. So I just want you to think about defect prevention for now and make it a goal and the objective of your testing effort. All right, let's get into how test design in general is thought of. So typically people will write scripts. The people who promote exploratory testing refer to it as scripted testing. So when you write scripts, that means that we actually have test cases or not, but you have scripts you have written, and those scripts will be executed either manually or automated. So that's kind of the highest level of formality in testing. Now, the next level is what we call informal scripted. It's not formal, meaning that it does not have all details. It's certainly not automated. This is normally for manual testing, because if you were to automate, if you were to run your tests automated, then you must write the script in some scripting language that the tool can understand. So so that's why the informal scripted is simply written in plain English to help people perform manual testing. Now, the next level, of course, is exploratory. And as I said, different people, including those who actually kind of invented exploratory testing, they have different opinion and different definition about exploratory testing. Well, today, I am not going to explain to you how James Buck or Kim Kainer or anyone else is doing exploratory testing. Today, you're going to learn about my own methodology of exploratory testing, which I call it disciplined exploratory testing. Okay. Now, the lowest level of formality is what people refer to as ad hoc. Many people confuse exploratory with ad hoc. I think there's a difference. Of course, I mean, your exploratory testing can become very ad hoc if you don't have a discipline in the process, right? I mean, it becomes ad hoc testing. So that's why many people say they are the same. But because the way I'm going to teach you exploratory testing today is more of a disciplined process, now it is very different from ad hoc, and I'll explain to you the difference. Okay, the level of formality goes down this way. So you all know about scripted testing. When you write scripts to be executed manually or automated, okay? So whether the script is formal or informal, scripts are written in advance. They might be written in a specific scripted language. They represent step by step to run the tests, and of course they also have steps to prepare the environment, what I call the preconditions. Or the setup for the tests, and it also have some steps to verify the results. And the advantage of this, of course, as you know very well, is that we can use those scripts for regression testing, because in regression testing, we don't write really new test cases or test scripts, but we use the test scripts we have used over time and rerun them automated, most likely, to make sure that nothing else has been broken. But we also know, I mean, the reason we started to hear about exploratory testing is that people found out that scripted testing might be too rigid for some kind of application or some kind of processes, or when you have some time limitation, okay? So exploratory testing is the kind of thing that people refer to it as doing just enough testing. So I'm not here saying that do not do scripted testing, because scripted testing or writing scripts is still very essential. But I'm going to show in this webinar, I'm going to show you how you can integrate exploratory testing into a more disciplined test design process where you can actually do both of them. So as I said earlier, informal scripted testing is written in plain English, not in specific scripting language. And it does not normally specify what the input is, what the setup is. It's just we write steps to be able to do it manually. So, and when I say it's almost like scenario level, those who are used to writing scenarios with the steps, it's, you know, they write it very much like that. They say, open this screen, enter this data, click this button, look at the resulting screen. You should see data like this, and so on. So that's really the informal scripting. All right, I'm putting in front of you one definition of what exploratory testing is from Kim Kainer. Nothing special about it, except, you know, I feel Kim Kainer really covered in this definition, covered the most important thing about exploratory testing. And there are two things here. It gives the tester a personal freedom to find bugs in his or her own way. But really, most importantly, if you look here, it's all about doing things concurrently. So treating the test-related learning, because in exploratory testing, we're supposed to learn from the tests we run. We learn and then we test more. And the test design activities and the test execution and how you interpret the results, putting all those together, as Kim Kainer says here, mutually supportive activities that are done in parallel. So you're really doing everything in parallel. That's why I took that part from Kim's definition in order to develop my own exploratory testing process. Now we're going to close here is the definition of ad hoc, which, as I said, some people confuse it with exploratory testing. When we do ad hoc testing, we don't pre-design the tests. We don't sit down and write test cases. We don't write scripts. We don't plan anything. We just sit down and test. We look at the screen, we try things, and hopefully we would document what we tried and so on. Ad hoc is not very good testing, although you will hear me actually saying that this might not be a bad idea as you are actually executing some tests. So ad hoc testing comes during the execution phase. So I will not tell you don't do ad hoc testing. Absolutely not. Ad hoc testing, it has its own place when you are sitting down there and executing either scripts manually or actually doing have exploratory test cases that you have written and you're running them. During that, you can go and explore further, and that would be considered ad hoc testing. So the ad hoc testing is just about exploring. That's why in the early days, people misunderstood exploratory testing and they thought it's all ad hoc. It's meaning that we sit down in front of the screen and just to try different things. No, no, that would not be useful. And if anyone thought that exploratory testing is that way, that was wrong. But exploratory testing must have a process to it. And as I said, I'm going to share with you my process to exploratory testing. All right. Here is one of the benefits, or the most important benefit that people report about exploratory testing, and that's the human brain can find more bugs without any restrictions. You let the human brain soar, you let the human brain explore, and the person will find more defects than giving that person a script to follow. Well, that's true. But also remember, that's not with everyone. Not everyone is able to do that, because not everyone is able to explore the same way. Some people are very good explorers, some people are not. So that's why here are some of my concerns. And I don't want to generalize here, because some people actually do exploratory testing and they eliminate those concerns completely. I'm worried about testers wasting time exploring areas that are not important at all. Okay, because again, they're not planning anything. So how do I, as a tester, get to explore only the important things? You know, it's like me again going to the East Coast and going to parks, going to places that are not interesting. Why do I do that? Because I do not have a prior knowledge of the areas I'm supposed to visit. So I go and see fireworks somewhere, I go and sit in a park somewhere, but I really did not hit all the important areas that I'm supposed to hit. And I found this to be very much true with many testers doing exploratory testing. So you got to be careful about that. Of course, the method I'm going to tell you eliminates all that problem. Of course, as we talked earlier about code coverage and requirement coverage, there is no evidence of coverage. You explore with the user interface, and there is no way to know what part of the code you have executed or what part of the requirement you have executed, because you did not have plan. You did not have, of course, you had the requirement or the user story, but you did not break the requirement in a certain way. You did not follow a systematic way to test. Exploratory testing has no systematic way. Exploratory testing is about all exploring. Okay, as we said, always with exploratory testing, there is no or very little documentation. Why? Because you're supposed to do it quick. So you're not writing everything. As a result, no repeatability. You can do exploratory testing in a certain way. If you bring me in, I'm not going to be able to do it the way you did it. So your skill is your skill. My skill, if I have any, it's my skills. Okay? I might be able to do the kind of good job you did, or I might not. So if we were to try to repeat some of the tests that were done during exploratory testing, it's impossible. Okay, we don't repeat them. So that's why exploratory testing does not really help regression testing very much. And I found that places who are very heavy in exploratory testing, they are very weak in regression testing. So let's not forget the importance of regression testing, because regression testing is the only way we can know if anything else has been broken or not. Now, if you were to try to trace test cases to requirements, again, that's almost impossible or difficult in exploratory testing. It's very important in many cases, especially if you're working for one of those companies that work in the regulated industries, whether it is automotive industry or medical devices or whatever. You have to have traceability. That's one of the requirements of the FDA and ISO standards, is to establish the traceability between requirements and test cases. Well, you cannot do this in exploratory testing. Okay? And as I mentioned, regression testing is almost impossible. I mean, you can do regression testing in other ways by writing scripts and so on, but you cannot rely on exploratory testing to feed into your regression testing. Based on those concerns that I have, for many years, I thought about having a much more disciplined approach to exploratory testing. Because the process, as you will see now, is going to address all the concerns in the previous slide, but most importantly, it will allow for repeatability for regression testing. It will allow for continuity. people leave the project, they go somewhere else, they, other people can follow the same process. You need to know who tested what, not just people explored. There has to be some status reporting. Of course, auditing is very important in many cases to avoid some legal liabilities. To me, as I said earlier, defect prevention is important. With this process of exploratory testing, you can easily do some defect prevention, and like write it down there, QA versus testing, because testing, as I said, is all about defect detection. All of us as testers think that our responsibility is about to find defects and write bug reports. QA, real QA, quality assurance, is really about trying to look at the process to prevent defects. When you are a true QA person, you're not just finding defects and writing bug reports, but rather you are helping the process. You are improving the process to eliminate those defects in the future. So now let's look at the process quick. So here are the 4 phases of the disciplined exploratory test process. We have planning, we have design, we have execution, and then we have bug reporting. What you see here, most importantly, is that 1, all of them are done at the same time. There is a slight shift here, which means you cannot do them exactly at the same time because you have to do a little bit of planning. And based on what you planned, you go and do some design. Okay, and you start executing the tests, and you start writing a bug report. But the nice thing here is this: as you can see, the arrow is going down from every place to every place. So while I'm writing my bug report, I can go back and explore more and find more defects, because I want to decide if this bug report I'm writing now, I should be writing for this problem only, or I can beef it up a little bit with some other observations if I execute a little bit more. While I'm executing, I can easily go back and redesign or design more, because I'm here executing some of the tests I designed here. But based on my exploration, when I'm testing, I might find that there are certain areas that I missed when I wrote the design. So I go back and design more, or modify my tested design a little bit. I know I'm scaring you, I'm scaring some people away with the term tested design. Well, there is no exploratory testing without tested design. If you are going to do exploratory testing without designing the tests, then you're not going to get good results. So while designing the tests, you might find out that you missed something when you did the planning. You go back and do the planning, and then come back and do more design. You do the planning, you do more design, and so on. As you can see, you can go back from any activity to any previous activity. Let's get into the details of this process. So what do we do in test planning? It's simply, on a very high level, what are we going to test? What are we going to test on a high level? When we come to test design, of course, I'll give you a little bit more details than that. When we get to test design, we decide on what are we going to test on a much lower level. So they're both about what to test. Now, the test execution is about how we're going to test it. So you run the tests you designed here, but you run it with an eye for exploration, meaning that when you run a test, you explore further. And as I said, you go back and redesign. When you write the bug report, same thing. You keep exploring as you're writing the bug report to find related bugs, because you don't want to find one bug and go and write a bug report. So when you write a bug report, you need to go back and explore and see if you need to add more things to that bug report or not. So here are essentially the 5 activities that I perform during exploratory testing planning. What features will we test? What user stories? What requirements? You might already know that, but if you don't, then you need to figure it out now. So maybe you start with the users, with a specific user story. So at least you know this is the feature you're testing. But most importantly, you think about the dependencies between these features. Which one should be done first? Which ones should be done together? Which user story, which requirement? Because some requirements are dependent on others. Some user stories are dependent on others. So if there is any dependencies between user stories or requirements. By the way, I'm using the word feature here in a generic way to mean either a requirement or user story, depending on whether your project is agile or not. Most importantly, to what extent will we test each feature? So I have a user story in my hand. How far am I going to test that user story? That's very important. So I'm keeping an eye on the requirement coverage here, because the user story is my requirement. Or if my project is non-agile, then my requirement is what it is. All right. So to what extent? Meaning that I need to break down the user story or the requirement. I know some people break the user story to acceptance criteria. You have to do that. I mean, there is no exploratory testing without that. Or as I suggest here in my process, you write scenarios for your user stories or for your requirements. Once you write a scenario or acceptance criteria, doesn't matter. You need to decide on how do you expect the system to handle each scenario or each acceptance criteria. Okay, so the outcome of the test planning process in exploratory testing is a set of scenarios. Now, when it comes to the time to design, you go a little bit more detailed. Remember, test design is about what are we going to test in a lower level. So now we start thinking about the input that we're going to be using, whether it's valid input and the invalid input. Now we start to also think about preconditions or what we call it the state of the system. If I am going to be testing the feature of, for example, canceling an order, what am I going to be thinking of as preconditions? Am I going to test canceling an order to cancel an order that exists or does not exist? Am I going to be testing to cancel an order that has been canceled before or not? Am I going to cancel an order that's refundable or non-refundable? These are the things you have to think about. You can't simply say, let me test how to cancel an order, and you go and test one of those and you're done. That's not a complete exploration. That's not a complete exploration. So you have to think about what I call the preconditions. And this term called the preconditions is actually taken from my test process, which I follow as a non-exploratory. I mean, they're still important. No one would say in exploratory testing, we are not going to be thinking about preconditions. It doesn't make sense. Because preconditions or the state of the system determines what tests am I going to run. So basically, as you can tell here, you are thinking about test cases, but you're thinking about them on the fly, informally, without having to write a lot of things. Now, would not make any sense not to think about the environment. Am I going to do this in this kind of browser or this browser? I mean, it doesn't make sense to say, okay, let me explore and I'm using Firefox and I found a problem. What if I try it in Edge or Internet Explorer? Is the problem the same? Does the problem exist? Is the problem resolved or not? Because when it comes to time to write a bug report, I need to make it all inclusive. I need to talk about which environment I used. Now, again, what do I expect as far as result? Remember, the last step in the test planning, I'm going to go back to the previous slide very quick. How do we expect the system to handle the scenario? If you already thought about this here, then this step here, what to expect, is going to be easy to come up. But if you ignored this during test planning, well, guess what? You have to figure it out here, because I am not going to do any exploratory testing without knowing what to expect. I know this is against many people who do exploratory testing. They say, oh, no, I don't care what to expect. I'm going to just try and see what happens. And then what? When you see what happens, are you going to say, well, this is good? Or you're going to say, well, this is bad? Determining whether the system did what's supposed to do or not is always based on what you expect. If you do not know what to expect, then it doesn't make any sense to run disciplined exploratory testing. It might make sense just to go and explore without knowing what happened, what should happen. and discover things that you didn't know about in order to learn. But eventually, if you were to write a bug report, I'm sure you know that. If you were to write a bug report, you have to know what do you expect, right? So these are the steps of test design. By the way, my apology. This is a 1 hour webinar. In a normal class, there's a workshop, so we learn this process in much more details by doing things. I understand the material seems to be dry here. Now let's find out how we can put all this into a discipline tested design process. Here is my typical tested design process that I teach people all the time. You have user stories, you have requirements, you may even have use cases. You take a user story or you take a requirement and collaborate and discuss and review and ask questions. Then based on the discussions here, you build the scenario. This is the process you learn if you were to take my regular courses that are not exploratory testing. Okay, so the outcome here is really scenarios. If you're using use cases, the use cases have their own scenarios and they are somewhat similar to those scenarios. I'm not going to get into the difference now. When you move to test to design, you either take those scenarios or take scenarios from use cases and you write your formal test cases. That's the formal testing. All right. And of course, you cluster those test cases together into test sets. And that's because you want to write scripts for each test set. Remember, we do not write a script for every single test case. We write a script, whether it is manual or automated, for a set of test cases that can be executed together. This is the process that you must always follow, that I teach in all my classes in a non-exploratory testing. Now, in order to do exploratory testing, it comes here in those light boxes. Exploratory testing is always based on what? User interface. Now, no one is going to tell me that I'm going to explore without user interface. Doesn't make any sense. All right? So you have the user interface. You do the same thing you would have done with user stories or requirements. And maybe, so it is the beauty of it now, I am mixing between formal testing using user stories and exploratory testing using user interface, following the same process. Taking the user interface, as we're going to see in a little bit, ask questions, analyze, and based on that, I come up with scenarios. While I'm writing my scenarios, I go back with some questions. All right. So what I do with user story, I do with user interface. And when I have my scenarios here, if I have the time, then I go formal testing and I write my test cases. If I don't have enough time, I go and write what I call exploratory test case. And you're going to see what this looks like in a little bit. All right. Now, you can take that exploratory test case and execute it. Or you can also cluster it together and write a script. Some people say, oh, so we write scripts in some exploratory testing? Well, if you want your exploratory testing to feed into your regression tests, then you have to write script. So how do we come up with scenarios? You start with the user interface. You can write scenarios right there. So you can look at the screen and you start writing scenarios. But you must write something. Your outcome here for the test planning is what? Is come up with scenarios. You may have to ask some questions and get some answers. And based on the answers you receive, you write scenarios. You might want to recover the requirement or the user story if you did not have them. See, if you just started with the user interface and you don't even know what this user interface was written for which user story, then guess what? You don't have a user story. So that's when I bring you to an application that says, here it is, explore. Fine. You explore, you look at the user interface, you explore, and you have to extract or you write down what you think the user story is. And from that, you can come up with scenarios. You can follow any one of those ways, but the bottom line is to come up with scenarios. Here is my simple explore, learn, document, and ask. Very simple process. It's cycle, explore your user interface, and learn as you explore. All right. You must always document what you learned, because if you don't, you're going to forget what you learned. You document what you learned in the form of what? A requirement, a scenario, an acceptance criteria. I don't care. Just write it down. See what you learned and write it down. Then you take it and you want to confirm. So you ask questions and you receive answers, because some of what you thought you learned and documented might be wrong. If it is confirmed, fine. If it is not, then explore further and learn more and document. You might find out that what you learned is correct. Then guess what? You go and explore more, and so on. It's cycle that continues. This is my simple process for exploratory testing. I put here an example of a scenario, but this is the same example I would have given to people when I teach them the non-exploratory testing. There is no difference, in my opinion. A scenario has a scenario title, which is required. And here's an example. Check in for a flight after the flight took off. This is the scenario I'm trying to test. If I do not have that, I cannot explore. I'm talking about disciplined exploratory testing. Scenario guided exploratory testing. Not just ad hoc exploratory testing. So that's my scenario that I'm trying to test. I could also think about preconditions or not, but look at the preconditions here and see if you could possibly test this without looking at this. So passenger has a reservation on flight. Of course, that's important, because if I'm going to test how to check into a flight after the flight took off, I mean, does the person have a reservation or not? Because if the person does not have a reservation, the result is going to be different. Did the person check in already before or not? Because if they did, then the results are going to be different. Has the flight actually taken off or not? It must, because that's the scenario I am testing. So these are the kind of preconditions I'm talking about. I have to think of those. Even if I don't document them, I'm going to have to consider them, because when I run an exploratory test to check into a flight after it took off, then I must make sure all these are true. Now, what do I expect? Do I want to go and test this without knowing what to expect? That would not be a good idea. Okay. I mean, of course, you can go and do that. And what if you tested that and you find out that the system allowed the person to check in to the flight and they get a boarding pass? What are you going to say? Are you going to say, okay, that's good then? No, that's not good. Are you going to say, well, that's not good because the system should not have allowed the person to check in? Well, okay, write that down. Sorry. Then write down here. Okay. The passenger should get a message with the flight departed already. Okay, that's what we expect. If we get that, then we're okay. So that's a scenario in exploratory testing. So now, how do we get to the next level, which is test design and write the exploratory test case? The exploratory test case has 3 components that are required. You cannot run a test without these. Of course, you need to have a test case number, you have the title, and you have what to expect. If you have more time, you can write a description. I doubt that you will ever need that, because I've never done that. But the description is only needed when the title of the test case is not descriptive enough. You need to think about preconditions, but hey, you might go ahead and run it without the preconditions. You need to think about the input, but the first 3 components are essential. All right. Now, if you already have your scenarios, you should be able to create your test cases quick, because you take the title of the scenario, it becomes the title of your test case. You take the scenario expected behavior, it becomes the test case expected behavior. And then you take the scenario preconditions. If you have written them, they become the test case preconditions. Very important. I mean, once you write your scenarios, you already wrote your test cases. You could also go and execute the scenarios as is without writing test cases. All right? But at least you have to make sure you have those things. You have the scenario number, you have the scenario title, and the expected behavior. And you don't even have to write test cases. Now, this is a much simpler way to do exploratory testing. It's not as disciplined as I'd like it to be. That's why I call it the desperate approach. Okay, you take the scenario as you wrote it. So all what you have to document now is the scenario number, scenario title, and what you expect. So when it comes to test execution, you have three ways to do it. One is simply to go explore and execute, and this is the ad hoc exploratory testing. There's no scenarios, no test cases, no user story, nothing. You just go explore, but most importantly, you have to document while you are testing. But normally this is done when you already have a script that was written and you are executing the script, but then you go on the side and explore. As I said earlier, I am okay with ad hoc testing if you do it at the same time when you're executing your scripts. You could also just take the user interface and write scenarios and execute scenarios as you just did. Or you can take the user interface, write scenarios, write exploratory test case, and this is what you execute. There are three modes here. My final conclusion is this: exploratory testing is very important because you can always find more bugs than what you can find with scripted testing. But you have to combine it with scripted testing. Always document what you test. If you did not write the scenarios, if you did not write the test cases, at least when you go and explore, then write what you are exploring, write what you expect to get, write what you've gotten, and whether this is acceptable or not. As I said earlier, the ability to explore is a skill that must be acquired over time. You cannot just test based on requirements or user stories by themselves because you do not get enough coverage. But also we already know just executing scripts is never enough to do thorough testing. My apology for the brief coverage here. I extracted this free webinar from my course. I'm doing a 2-day course online as a live interactive course on April 6th and the 7th. If you're interested in how to actually follow this process in a workshop setting and doing this exactly, you can sign up for the course on April 6th and 7th. And if you don't have the time to attend this course, the same course is available as a self-paced course, pre-recorded. You can take it anytime as you wish without having to be available on a specific day and time. It's a self-paced course. Thank you for joining me today. My apology for the brief coverage of the topic, but I know I could not cover it in much more details in 1 hour. Hope to join me in future webinars. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available at the IIST website early next week. I have an interesting question here. What software development lifecycle phase we should start doing exploratory testing? And what RACI should we follow? I don't know. Sorry, I don't know what RACI is. My apology. But to answer the first part of your question, it is the time when we are looking at the user story and the requirement. So during requirement analysis, during user story analysis, that's when you actually start. Okay, and you start by planning your tests during that time. I already showed you the screen, the slide that shows the requirements, the user stories on the top, and then you have, but again, you will not be able to start planning your exploratory testing before the user interface is available. So now this depends on your project. When do developers have the user interface developed? Because everything is based on the user interface. Some teams do not do the user interface until very late in the life cycle. And that's bad. That does not allow for good exploratory testing. Some teams do not have the user interface until the whole system is complete. Well, there's no much place for exploratory testing because you're now jamming. You cannot plan anything. You cannot design anything. So as you can see, my planning for exploratory testing start when the user interface is available. And if your team has done some prototyping, that should be available early enough. Another question here, can the prototype be considered as user interface? Absolutely, yes, if it is stable enough. But if they're going to keep changing it every day, then you do not want to start the planning or designing yet until it is somewhat stable. I still have a question from Don. If Don is still around, let me answer this question. Don says, so requirement traceability is used the same for exploratory tests and for formal testing? Of course, requirement traceability is essential. You have to do it. So that's why I say If you're doing formal testing, fine. If you're doing exploratory testing, you have to find a way to trace requirements to test cases and vice versa. And the only way you can do it is when you do exploratory test cases the way I explained it. Because then you have your scenarios, your user stories, you have your test cases, you can do the traceability. So yes, the short answer to your question is that absolutely. Requirement traceability is essential and important, must be done regardless of what type of testing you are doing. Bill had a question about, say, can you explore the link from requirements to use cases? To use cases. I am assuming you are referring to this slide here, up here. Am I right? Yes, that's the only link I have between the requirement and use cases. And this is outside the topic of exploratory testing. But of course, in many projects that are using use cases, the way we do it is we take a requirement, and the requirement is sometimes is big. So a use case, as you probably know, since you're asking the question, a use case is simply a model of interaction between the different actors in the system. So I could possibly talking about the process of checking into the flight and getting a boarding pass. So this is the requirement. The use case for that will show the actors, that's the passenger, the reservation system, the ticketing system, and any other system. If the person is allowed to check luggage during checking into the flight, then it might have also the luggage management system as one of the actors. So simply we write a use case for a specific requirement. The relationship between requirements and use cases is always one-to-one. Again, I have a course on exploring the requirements with use cases that discuss this in all details there. Thank you, Don. Thanks to everyone. I'm going to close. Since I don't have any more questions, I will close now.